He spoke in such a tone of savage, exultant triumph, that I recoiled momentarily from him, even while I ground my teeth in rage and nodded my acquiescence to his plans, for I could not but remember that Selim was the man who had dishonored me, and repaid my services with the blackest treachery. "Selim is but a poor creature," said Mansour, "a foe scarce worthy of us peers, yet is the wrong he had done you a bitter one indeed. The conditions of his earth life made him a king, yet in the spirit world he is little more than a precocious child, weak-minded and of evil tendencies. Between his parents, there was no real affinity, no spiritual union. The attraction exercised by each was merely that of their animal soul, therefore in their son you dost behold only the transmission of the lower qualities of the parents, while the lack of true affinity causes Selim to be like an ill-constructed harp, not one of whose strings canst you bring into tuneful harmony with another. You canst not blend his qualities so that they make a perfect whole. One contradicts another continually, even as between the higher natures of the parents there was continual friction, though the glamour, which was cast over both by the purely magnetic attraction of their animal souls prevented them at first from feeling this. Had the inharmony of relation between the parents been but a few degrees greater, Selim would have been an idiot. As it is, he had enough sense to pass for an intelligent, responsible being in the eyes of those whose interest it was to be indulgent to his failings. Behold him now, stripped of all the forced glitter of royalty and dependent upon himself for the surroundings he creates. Mansour pointed to a flickering spark of light at an immense distance from us, and by steadily watching it, I saw at last that it illuminated a minute picture of the palace of Basaikh in the rooms occupied by Selim. Presently the picture grew clearer, as though a strong glass reflected it to me, and I perceived that to Selim's eyes, it bore the same appearance as in his earth life, save that the furniture, the walls, and hangings, all looked cracked and stained with muddy patches and torn. In the center sat Selim himself, on a throne he had built for himself from the fragments of a larger one, which lay scattered about as though by an earthquake shock. The crown upon his head and the gold of his ornaments were tarnished like his honor, and his robes were soiled and draggled like the once purity of his soul. He himself presented a curious appearance, for in stature and face he was like a child, though his body was bent and his countenance furrowed like those of an aged man. The feeble yet vicious expression of his mouth, with its full red lips half open and the weak chin covered by as few thin, straggling hairs in place of his once luxuriant beard, added yet another touch to the general picture he presented of weak-minded vanity. Behind him there lurked the hideous figure of the black slave from whose obsessing spirit I had sought to free him on earth. The expression of this spirit was savage to the last degree, and he appeared to spend his time crawling backwards and forwards through the fatal secret passage, as though unable to withdraw himself from its attraction. Around Selim himself, I saw a great many dark figures, whose forms much resembled those of the genii I had beheld in the mystic valley, and mingling with them were certain spirits of a low type who seemed to have been slaves in earth life, and who were now attracted to the court and waited upon Selim under the confused impression that they were still in their earthly bodies. These last spirits he seemed to see, but to the presence of the others he was oblivious. "Behold," said Mansour, "in earth life Artemisia drew around her by her angry, vengeful thoughts a whole host of dark spirits whose influence shadowed her son even from his cradle. They gathered around him and sucked away his spiritual life, so that the spirit body grew stunted and feeble, and even the earthly envelope suffered in sympathy and became feeble and ailing. They instilled foul thoughts into his mind, and they used his body as a medium whereby they could enjoy over again those material pleasures for which they still craved. Thus was the private life of King Selim one of much degradation and shame without the spirit of Selim himself being conscious of it. To use the body thus, it is needful to dispossess the rightful spirit, which is thus left in an unconscious state in close proximity to its envelope, as you dost already know. Had Selim been a conscious participator in the iniquities wrought by the agency of his earth body, his state now would be akin to that of the dark spirits around us. As it was, he suffered in the enfeebled condition of his body for the use thus made of it without knowing to what agency it was due. In spirit life he had but the development of a child, yet is his spirit body worn and aged by the vices of the man. Time will equalize all things, and will give to him the growth of his spirit into manhood. Then will it be for him to use his powers for his own elevation or degradation, as the temper of his mind shall incline him. Call him unto you now. Draw him unto this sphere that you may show him how richly you canst recompense him for all the favors he showered on you, and on your wife. Manzur laughed again and again as he said this, with a scornful glee that so maddened me I could have struck him to the earth had he not withdrawn from me even as he uttered his sneer at the mention of my wife. And though my contempt for Selim had well nigh extinguished my anger against him, the words of Manzur kindled my passion once more to fever heat, and I called aloud upon the wretched Selim to come unto me with all speed. Thrice I called, and ere the summons was well repeated for the third time I beheld Selim at my side. Bewildered at thus suddenly finding himself in my presence, and uneasy at the recollection of his own treachery towards me, the wretched Selim addressed me in trembling querulous tones, into which he tried in vain to infuse a little of his old royal dignity, and asked why I should have summoned him thus. You may well ask that, you miserable semblance of a man, replied I scornfully. You may well wonder why I should desire the presence of so poor a worm of earth as you false viper. Who could even turn to sting the hand stretched forth to rescue you? It may be that you hast even forgotten that from so contemptible a dog, it was possible I would demand a reckoning when the day of our reckoning at last should come. Dost you imagine that I have forgotten one tittle of the wrongs inflicted on me by you, and yet more foully by your mother Artemisia? As I uttered the queen's name, I suddenly beheld her image before me reflected in the air, even as one beholds a mirage in the desert, though the scene reflected may be far away. I not only saw this reflection of Artemisia, but I saw pictured beside her the reflections of myself and Selim. She had pushed back the long wild black locks of her dishevelled hair with one hand, and with the other, she shaded her eyes as she looked fixedly at my reflection. That of Selim was as yet so faint and dim by reason of his thoughts, not being yet fully concentrated upon her, that she did not perceive him. Me she addressed in tones of savage hate, saying, Is this indeed you, Ahrinziman, you illicit spawn of a miserable Greek slave, who did deem, forsooth, that you was fit to be a king? Art you come at last in answer to my calls for you? Yea, O woman, I am come at last to settle the great debt between us. Let not your foul lips utter the name of mine angel mother, slain by you, that you shouldst add another drop unto the cup of my wrath, too full already, and of whose bitterness you shall drink even to the last dregs in a fashion you dost little dream of yet. Had it not been said of old that you shall demand an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? But I say to you that you shall repay me with your sufferings 100-fold for all that you hast made me and mine suffer. Think of my tender mother and her cruel death. Think of Zuleika, sacrificed to your malice, and to the passion of your son. Think of the slow agony of her death, as hour by hope died within her heart, and the fierce pangs of hunger and despair destroyed inch by inch her mortal life. Think of the horror of such a death, and marvel not that since you art beyond my powers of vengeance, I should take it from your son. Behold, he is here. I have summoned his spirit unto me, and I show him to you now that you may see his sufferings, while you art as powerless to save him one pang as I was to save one of your victims. Behold, thus do I let loose the powers of this dark sphere upon your son. I wave my hand towards the wretched Selim, and like a pack of wild beasts, the whole savage multitude rushed upon him and attacked him with teeth and claws and hands, human and inhuman monsters alike eager to tear him to pieces. But it was not my purpose to so quickly end the scene. I desired to prolong the agony of Artemisia and her son, and ere they had done more than wound Selim's spirit, I forced the savage creatures to retire again, bidding the low cruel spirits that were human once to approach him one by one and amuse themselves with him, even as a cat plays with a mouse. As for Selim, he lay upon the ground, in a helpless agony of fear, uttering cries unto his mother, whom he now thought he saw beside him. To save him, Then I saw Artemisia striving to break through the wall between us, even as I had once striven to break through to her, and when at last she realized that she was powerless to reach us, she gave utterance to a cry of such supreme anguish, such intense despair, that I wavered in my fell purpose, and almost involuntarily arrested the advance of those who were torturing Selim. The sacredness of the mother's love, the sufferings through which a woman gives birth unto her child, the divinity of that holy tie, all rose up before my mental vision and forbade me to torture a mother through the tenderest, holiest emotion of her soul. Yea, even though she had sinned against me as deeply as had Artemisia. At this very moment, when revenge was within my power, when I might have drugged myself to satiety with the sight of my enemy's sufferings, I gave up the contest, and allowed the opportunity to slip from my grasp. My hand, stretched out to destroy, fell powerless at my side, paralyzed by the agony of the mother's cry for mercy for her child. It required all my power to drag off the savage dark spirits I had so nearly let loose in all their malice upon Selim. All the force of my strong will was scarce adequate for the task, but at last I saw them gather like an evil crowd of vultures and sink slowly down from sight. Then I waved my hands over the wretched Selim and bade him be free from me forever, whereupon he too vanished. As he disappeared, a tremendous flash of lightning rent the sky, a mighty clap of thunder shook the ground, and I beheld the furious countenance of the dark angel as he towered above me in his wrath. "Behold," said he in a deep voice of intense wrath, "behold, I have done my part. I have given you the boon that you did crave, and like a capricious child you hast flung it from you because your mood has changed. You art a mighty one to think to rule in hell. You, who canst not keep your fell purpose for 1 hour. Behold, I have fulfilled my share of our bargain. Now must you fulfill your." For one brief moment I beheld the fearful fiend, then a great chasm opened beneath my feet and engulfed me. Down and down I sank in the awful darkness. It seemed to me that I was sinking down forever. Chapter 10. The Kingdom of the Dark Angel, doomed to the Black Pit. How will power save me? The sport of the angels of Inferno. The origin of dark angels. Why they are beyond mortal ken. At last my downward journey was suddenly arrested, and I found myself in what appeared to be a vast black pit. Walls of jagged rock rose up on all sides, and through the darkness I could dimly perceive that they extended to a great distance all around me. As I tried to rise and stand upon my feet, I found that my limbs were loaded with ponderous chains, and it was only with great difficulty and after many efforts that I was at last able to raise myself to an upright position. To walk seemed impossible, so heavy were my fetters. As I became accustomed to the darkness, I began to see that I was not alone. Huge phantoms hovered near me with outspread wings, and as my sight grew clearer I saw that upon the forehead of each there glowed a single spark of crimson fire, while their faces were instinct with the strong life and power with which the force of my own passions had endowed them. As I looked again and again upon these hovering shapes that loomed through the darkness like avenging spectres, and approached ever nearer and nearer to me with threatening gestures, I recognized them to be the genii of revenge and hatred, of cruelty and murder, which I had seen in the phantom valley of the genii. Now these strange beings had grown to twice their former size, and possessed a degree of intelligence and a power of action more than double that which they had possessed before. They gathered around me like destroying angels, and hemmed me in on every side, while yet fresh and ever fresh phantoms floated down to swell the throng. The glittering, scale-like robes they wore seemed to wrap me round and crush me, as the anaconda crushes the body of its victims. The dull sparks of fire that shot from their fierce eyes seemed to pierce my brain as with 100 knife stabs. Their hot breaths were like the fumes from a furnace upon my cheeks, and their talon-like claws were extended to tear my flesh. Suddenly I bethought me of the words of Abubatha when he had spoken to me in the last dream I had on earth. None can have dominion over your soul unless you thyself give them the power. And I said unto myself, shall I, who am immortal, suffer these soulless beings of the astral world to assault me and tamper with my freedom? Is it not I who should dominate them, and hold them as mere servants of my will? I stamped my fettered foot upon the ground and stretched forth my manacled hands towards these hideous shapes, crying unto them, Avaunt! Ye foul fiends of evil passions, avaunt ye! Get ye gone unto your own habitations, for I will yield my soul unto such influences no more. As I uttered these words, the chains, which I had thought had bound me, fell asunder and left me free, while the dark shapes rolled like a foul mist away, leaving me standing alone in the dark pit. How long I remained in the darkness I know not, but it seemed a long time, for my thoughts traveled over and over again through all the events of my earth life and my experiences in the spirit world. My memory gave me back picture after picture, till I could bear the recollections no longer, and I arose to wander through the darkness and find whether there was no outlet to my prison. Round and round the black, rocky walls I wandered, but there was no possible means of escape that I could find. It appeared to me that I thus wandered in the darkness for what must have been weeks of earthly time. Nothing could I see but myself and the black rocks around me. No sound broke the stillness but the sound of my own voice as I called from time to time, in hopes the voice would answer me, yea, even though it might be the voice of the dark angel himself. At last, in despair, I sat down upon the hard ground, and the oblivion of sleep fell upon my senses, rendering me for a time unconscious of my terrible position. After a long sleep, I awoke to hear a voice calling me, which I recognized to be that of Manzur. It appeared to come from above me, and said, Aha! Ho, Ahrinziman! Art you indeed enjoying your slumbers in this fair kingdom, which our great master had given you? Dost you enjoy your sovereignty over the only things in this land, which you art fit to control? Or doth your curiosity prompt you to see a little more of the wondrous sphere of which you hast become an inhabitant? Behold, the dark angel summons you unto his presence, that he may gauge the value of the service you did offer him. Manzur laughed, as though my condition afforded him much amusement, and then in answer to my inquiries as to how I was to obey the dark angel's summons, he let down a rope, up which I climbed till I found myself standing beside him on an extensive plateau of hard soil, plentifully bestrewn with ashes. The thick, heavy atmosphere above us, the dark night sky and heavy clouds, prevented me from seeing far in any direction, but as I followed my conductor, I observed the towers and buildings of a vast city looming through the blackness before us. Here and there great tongues of lurid flame shot upward from the earth, but their light only served to illuminate the space immediately around, showing numberless dark figures of spirits, which danced around the flames and hurried to and fro as though intent upon some business. As we drew near the city, I saw that it resembled closely a great capital of the Eastern Empire. The mighty domes of the palaces glowed with the dull crimson of monster fires within, and from the lofty towers, flaring beacons of blood-red light flung their rays across the dark plains. At every step, the feet sank deep into the thick ashes of burnt-out passions, which strewed the ground, and the close stifling sulphurous smoke that rolled upwards in great clouds continually, was scorching as the breath of a colossal furnace. Myriads of spirits of every shade of color and every race of people passed us, engaged in every variety of task, and in every condition of abject misery it was possible to conceive. Some served as beasts of burden to their more powerful fellows, and were driven on with savage blows and imprecations. Others were tormented by those around them, that their contortions of agony might amuse the spectators. Everywhere and on all the buildings there was the same stamp of foulness and ruin and decay. The stones of the streets seemed to ooze with blood, and the wells to drip with it. The whole fearful scene was lit up by the flaring beacons on the lofty towers, as they flashed their red light through the all-pervading darkness. Before the inner courtyard of the largest palace, I beheld an immense square, wherein an enormous multitude of spirits congregated, as though awaiting the arrival of some powerful personage. The interior of the square was arranged like a vast amphitheater. At one side there was a throne, which glowed like burnished copper. It was supported by black marble pillars and approached by a flight of 50 marble steps. At the sides of each step knelt the headless figure of a spirit. The heads, which had evidently been struck from the bodies with a scimitar, were placed between the knees of the figures. Impassive and motionless they knelt, and but for the eyes, which moved at times, as though watching those around them, I should have imagined that they were mere images of stone. To my inquiring glance Manzur replied, "These spirits represent a pleasing pastime indulged in by our master, the Dark Angel, during his earthly existence. These spirits were all captives in war, and at a festival such as this, we are about to attend, the Dark Angel, then Emperor of an Eastern kingdom, of great power, caused these men to be bound in a kneeling position such as you see them in now, and directed that the most skillful swordsman of his army should ride towards them at full speed and with their scimitars sever the head from the body at a single stroke, and any swordsman who failed to cut off the head at the first blow was at once decapitated himself as a clumsy bungler, unfit for his master's service. These figures you see here are but the remaining few of the many thus killed. They were once numbered by hundreds, but gradually, as the thirst for vengeance upon their conqueror died out of their hearts, they passed out of these dominions, and the mere astral shells they left behind became, as you will see, a decoration of our master's palace." He pointed to the palace behind, and looking intently at it, I saw with a shudder that the whole front was garnished at a distance of a few feet apart, with decaying spirit bodies of men, all headless and all kneeling like those upon the steps, the horrible appearance they presented in their mouldering, repulsive condition being indescribably revolting. I wondered it did not make the Dark Angel shudder every time he entered his palace to see these gruesome sentinels lining his walls. And yet the rest of the building was after all in keeping with this fantastically horrible decoration. Queer ghastly shapes were outlined on it everywhere, and silhouetted in shades of grey and crimson upon the black stones. I was still examining the fearful palace when a heavy black curtain that hung before the principal door was drawn aside by invisible hands, and as the glare of fiery light within the palace lit up the entrance, I saw a strange procession come out. First there came a motley mass of spirits who seemed mere slaves attending on the emperor. These flung down what looked like the skins of wild beasts torn reeking from a living animal, to serve as a carpet for the emperor and his suite. Next there came a band of minstrels with cymbals and harps in their hands, but as every instrument was out of tune, every string either twisted or broken, and every cymbal cracked, the noise they extracted was a torture to the ear. Nevertheless they played on to the delight of the emperor, who seemed to enjoy the annoyance this ear-splitting symphony inflicted upon the more sensitive nerves of those around him. A great many spirits, whose dignity of bearing proclaimed them personages of importance, accompanied the emperor, who towered over all around him, not only in the magnificence of his stature and the proportions of his figure, but also in his intellectual powers. His robes were of a deep purple, almost black, and with a crimson border that looked as though it had been dyed in human blood. Upon his head he wore a crown of flame, that flickered or grew bright as the softer or fiercer emotions stirred his soul. In the front of the crown there gleamed a blood-red star, like a gigantic ruby, whose rays shot out like spears dipped in blood. By the side of this spirit, whom I at once recognized as the Dark Angel, there walked another spirit, almost as tall and almost as powerful, whose dress resembled the others in all respects save that his crown glittered like a crown of steel, and his star was green as an emerald, and the bordering of his robe had a green shimmer like the scales of a serpent's body. From the shoulders of each of these two spirits, there rose what seemed to my eyes like folded wings of dark gossamer. At first I thought they grew to the shoulders, but on a closer examination I saw that they were but a part of the drapery. How can I describe the faces of these two powerful dark spirits? How find mere words to express at once the all-pervading wickedness, the stamp of sensuality, of cruelty, of hatred to all things on earth, or in heaven and hell, that was impressed upon their countenances? Or how describe the subtle charm they seemed to exercise over all around them? How can I show to mortal eyes the strange perfection of form and feature, that was yet so indefinably marred by the hideousness of the souls within? The language of man seems poor and expressionless when one seeks to show by its aid the ethereality and yet the tangibility of the spirit body, the strange likeness and yet unlikeness to the mortal form. the powerfulness of the personality and yet the aerial nature of its envelope. Only those who have once seen a glimpse of these angels of the dark spheres can fully realize how subtle and how great is at once the attraction and repulsion which they exercise over all those who behold them. Beside these powerful beings, whose evil natures were so colossal as to raise them above all around them, the other dark spirits seemed mere insignificant impersonations of wickedness, and I realized at last what a king in hell must mean. To my eyes, the angel of the blood-red star seemed so much above even his companion angel that I took him to be none other than Ahriman himself, the great prince of evil, and I said so to Mansur. Nay, Ahrinziman, you art wrong. Those who would endow the great principle of evil with a personality are wrong. He had no more a form or shape, which can be discerned by a mortal mind, or personified in the image of a man, than had the great principle of good, whom men designate the supreme God. No eye, be it of mortal or of spirit, had ever seen them, and of their ultimate nature none can tell, since all alike are ignorant of it. The angels of paradise worship the divine idea of goodness under the name and symbol of Ormuz, even as we in these dark spheres bow ourselves and yield up our wills to the great principle of evil whom we call Ahriman. And in doing so, is it not enough for us with our limited powers to know that we choose thereby the upward or the downward path? Can we hope that to our strivings after truth all knowledge can at once be revealed? Man rushes too often to hasty conclusions, formed from the imperfect glimpses he had seen of these angels of light and darkness, and those whom we have thought to be the all-powerful supreme God, or the great embodiment of evil, were but angels of either the light or dark spheres, such beings, in fact, as are before us now, whose mighty force of will when exercised either for good or evil compels all lesser wills to bend before their decrees. The angels of light mine eyes have not beheld since the days of mine own youth on earth, when I was vouchsafed dim glimpses of their glorious forms. For you may know that I was dedicated unto the priesthood. Temptation assailed me, and I fell, transgressing my vows and fleeing at last from the temple where I served. Then did the love of occult knowledge appeal to mine ambitions, and led me yet further astray, till the serpent of evil, as men call their own base desires in the hope that they thus transfer a share of their responsibility to the personification of the evil principle, extinguished the good, and only the charms of the senses now allure me. The only angels I can see are such as these, yet do I know that in the bright spheres there are angels, the glory of whose kingdoms no words of man can paint. Are these angels, then, a separate creation from man? I asked. It had been taught that the angels in heaven rebelled against Ormuzd and were cast forth. Are these beings before us some of those fallen angels? You may call them fallen angels if you dost desire, for if a man sin, doth not the angel that is within him fall into subjection to his lower nature? But if you dost mean that these were ever angels dwelling in the heaven of the bright spheres, then I tell you no. For no conquest is possible there. The very harmony by which they exist, and which is the very essence of the difference between them and us, forbids aught of contest in their spheres. These angels of darkness, like kindred angels of light, are like the offspring of mortality. All have once known material life upon some planet, but in ages so remote that there are no records left to man of their histories. It had been told to me, but I know not whether it be true, since I know only what the experiences of the dark spheres can teach, that the dark angels do in time cast off the scales of darkness and arise from sin, and through paths whose ways are extended beyond our power to follow, they ascend at last to the state of the bright angels, and reign in the glorious realms of the golden star. But inasmuch as the evil they have wrought had been colossal, even so must the path of their repentance be colossal in its difficulties, and the sum of their atonement almost beyond the power of our thoughts to conceive. Even for such as I am, the path of repentance seems so long and hard, stretching as it does through all the many centuries in which I have lived and sinned, that though there are times when I turn my yearning eyes towards it, in weariness of the scenes around me here, I hesitate and shrink back from its difficulties and its infinite toil and suffering. The gross pleasures of my senses still enthrall me, and even my thirst for the higher knowledge of the spheres of light cannot draw me to the path by which alone I can hope to win it. If at times my divine soul is awakened by the thought of the unexplored wonders that the light spheres must contain, and which my intellect ever tells me would repay me for all my sufferings, my animal soul drowns the pure whisperings with its fierce clamorings for those gross pleasures, which only the earth can afford to it, and again and yet again, I return to earth and seek the control of an earthly body as a means of gratifying the all-potent demands of that baser self, which is too strong for the higher aspirations of my better nature. Thus do I chain myself within these spheres,